James hadn't expected anything remarkable when he took the winding road out of the city that morning, the kind of road that meandered through skeletal trees and narrow valleys, where the fog settled like a living thing, curling around the cracks in the asphalt and muffling the world in a blanket of gray. A veteran of over 20 years, James had been everywhere the world could break a man. Deserts where the sun stripped the skin from your bones, jungles where the humidity was so thick you could taste it with every breath, and cities where gunfire shattered lives in seconds. He had survived them all, and yet, even now, years after leaving active service, he felt the echoes of those places press down on him in quiet moments. Some things never truly leave you, he thought. They sit in your chest like a weight you can't put down, quietly pulling at your every heartbeat. Today, he had told himself, it would be a simple drive, a quiet escape to shake off the memories that surfaced most acutely when the world was still and gray. But the day had other plans. As he drove, the fog thickened, curling around the edges of the trees and rolling across the uneven road like a living tide. His old pickup rumbled along, tires crunching over frost-bitten gravel, and for a moment, the only sound in the world was the engine, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to connect with the steady pulse in his chest. And then he saw it, a car, or rather what was left of a car, rusted and abandoned, wedged awkwardly against the embankment at the side of the road. Its paint had long peeled away in irregular patches, exposing the corroded steel beneath, streaked with deep lines of rust that made the car look like it had been bleeding for years. The tires were half sunk in the soft, damp earth, and weeds had crept up over the hood and windows, coiling around the frame as if trying to reclaim it for the soil. But it wasn't the car that made him stop. It was the dog. A German shepherd stood beside the driver's door, tall and alert, its dark coat flecked with gray around the muzzle, golden eyes piercing and unwavering. Not aggressive, not barking, but with a posture that was tense, disciplined, purposeful. Every muscle seemed coiled with energy and memory, every hair bristling with quiet authority. James killed the engine instinctively, gripping the steering wheel as though it anchored him to reality. He had faced danger before, in ways that should have prepared him for anything, but there was something about this moment, something primal that made his instincts flare. This dog wasn't just guarding a car, it was guarding a memory, a secret, a loss. The air was thick with the smell of wet metal, rust, and decay, but beneath it there was another scent, faint and elusive, a trace of something darker, almost mournful. James exhaled slowly, stepping out of the truck, boots crunching over frost-hard soil. "Hey boy," he called softly, not expecting trust, only acknowledging presence. The shepherd's ears flicked, but its gaze never broke. It didn't move, not an inch. The dog tilted its head slightly, ears forward, watching, assessing, holding the space like a sentinel who had waited decades for someone to arrive. James circled the car cautiously, taking in the shattered windows, the bent door frames, the remnants of what had clearly once been a functioning vehicle. The back tire was half submerged in mud, the front dented and askew. Every line of rust, every broken panel whispered of struggle. Then he saw it. Claw marks etched into the mud beneath the back door, sharp, deep, and jagged. They led up the side of the car in a desperate zigzag, uneven and frantic. James froze, the veteran's blood running cold, not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen claw marks before, on doors ripped open by desperate animals, on walls where terrified people had tried to escape, but these marks were human-sized. Someone, or something, had fought to escape. The shepherd's body tensed, ears forward, nose brushing the cold earth. A low, broken whine escaped its chest, soft at first, then rising in pitch, a sound so raw that James's heart clenched. This wasn't panic. This was remembrance. The dog wasn't afraid of him. It was remembering a moment, a terror, a loss. James knelt slowly, flashlight in hand, shining the beam into the interior of the car. The upholstery was torn, the padding shredded, springs exposed like the ribs of a long-dead animal. Then a small glint caught his eye beneath the debris. A tiny shoe, caked in dirt and mud, laces frayed and twisted. James swallowed, throat tight. The shepherd, Atlas, as he would come to think of him, shivered, lowering its body closer to the ground, tail tucked, whine growing as if it were recalling something too painful to name. James reached forward, hand trembling, and lifted the shoe. Atlas pressed his forehead against James's arm, trembling in a way that spoke of devotion, grief, and memory carried alone for years. He looked inside the car more carefully now, flashlights sweeping across the torn interior, over rusted metal and faded fabric. Then he found it, a blanket, small and faded, dotted with white stars, mold-stained but intact. He unfolded it slowly, and there, stitched into the corner, faint but unmistakable, was a name, Emily. James's chest tightened. The pieces fell into place, the claw marks, the abandoned car, the vigilant shepherd. This had been no random wreck, no forgotten vehicle. This had been a tomb, and Atlas had been its guardian, waiting all these years for someone to see, to acknowledge, to remember. Atlas whined again, long and low, pressing closer, nudging James gently, guiding him to a rear panel where the floor sagged unnaturally. James pried it up, heart hammering. Beneath it, wrapped in the moldy blue blanket, were remnants of a child, fragile and silent. Atlas let out a soft, guttural sound, pressed his head into James's chest, trembling, mourning, loyal beyond measure. James realized, in a suffocating instant, that the dog had carried this grief alone, waiting decades to be acknowledged, to be joined in his vigil. The rain began to fall gently, tapping on the rusted roof, as James crouched beside Atlas, the veteran and the shepherd bound together by shared understanding, by the weight of what had been lost, and by the story waiting to be told. James sat back on his heels, still holding the small, mud-caked shoe in his hand, feeling the weight of years and memory press down on him. Atlas remained close, body rigid, ears forward, golden eyes fixed on the rear of the car, as though waiting for James to understand what had been kept secret for decades. The blanket, faded blue and dotted with white stars, lay partially unfolded beside him, the edges frayed and stiff with mildew. James traced the name stitched into the corner with his finger. Emily. A child's name, a life that had ended too soon. And Atlas had been there, all these years, guarding the memory, guarding her remains, waiting. The morning fog thickened, curling around the rusted shell like a shroud. James could feel the chill of the air creeping into his bones, but he was unaware of it. His mind and heart were elsewhere, pressed against the sharp edges of grief and loyalty. He reached under the blanket carefully, brushing aside layers of dirt and decayed fabric. His gloved hands felt the contours beneath, the fragile outline of a child, wrapped in the remnants of a world that had failed her. Atlas let out a low, shuddering whine, trembling visibly, head pressed into James's arm. It was not fear. It was remembrance. It was grief that had been too heavy to carry alone, pressed into every muscle and tendon of the dog's body. James felt tears welling, unbidden. The veteran who had seen horrors in the deserts and jungles, now shaking with the weight of something far more human, intimate, and cruel. James whispered softly, almost to himself. "You've been carrying this alone, haven't you, boy? All this time." Atlas tilted his head slightly, nudging James's hand as if confirming the truth. His golden eyes were wet, shimmering, reflecting the pale light of the fog-diffused sun. James noticed how the dog's body shifted, muscles taut but trembling, paws scraping at the frozen earth in restless movements. It was as if he were trying to communicate, to guide James, to ensure the remains were seen, acknowledged, respected. The veteran could feel the centuries of loyalty and grief entwined into Atlas, a bond with Emily that had never broken, that had survived neglect, fear, hunger, and loneliness. James crouched lower, taking a careful breath. His flashlight swept the interior again. Torn upholstery, rusted metal, the faint outline of something once living, now reduced to remnants of fabric and bone. Then he noticed the dented panel beneath the rear floor, the one that sagged and felt unnatural under his fingers. Atlas pressed closer, sniffing and pawing at the edge, pushing James gently toward it. "All right, I see it," James murmured, carefully lifting the warped panel. Beneath it lay a small, fragile bundle, wrapped in the same mold-stained blanket he had already unfolded. His hands trembled, the veteran in him trained to endure fear and blood, but this was different. Reverence, sorrow, helplessness, all tangled into one, choking sensation that made it hard to breathe. Atlas pressed his nose against the bundle, whining softly, his body shaking from head to tail. It was a sound of mourning, of decades of loss, of a bond that death could not sever. James knelt beside him, flashlight illuminating the small bones cradled in the fabric, tiny and delicate, the remnants of a child too young to understand the cruelty of fate. Every instinct in him, the protector, the soldier, wanted to hold the dog, to comfort him. But he knew Atlas needed no comfort in that moment. He needed acknowledgement, a witness to the years he had carried alone. James swallowed hard and laid a hand gently on the shepherd's head. "You kept her safe," he whispered, "even when no one else could." Atlas pressed closer, leaning into the hand that offered warmth, letting his body tremble against James's side. James's mind worked through the fragments. How had the car come to this? Why had the child ended up here? The pieces assembled slowly. The claw marks, the abandoned vehicle, the dog's vigilance. Atlas hadn't just survived, he had remembered. And his memory was precise, loyal, unbroken. The car was a tomb, yes, but it had been a tomb that Atlas had watched over with the care and dedication of a soldier guarding the fallen. James felt a deep ache in his chest, the weight of duty and loss mirrored in the trembling body beside him. He looked again at the blanket, now fully unfolded, and the name stitched into it burned into his mind: Emily. A child whose life had ended too soon, whose death had been silent, whose story had been left in the shadows. James felt the veteran's compulsion stir. He would not leave this untended. He could not. Atlas had carried the grief of decades. It was now James's responsibility to bear witness, to help the shepherd honor the child. Slowly, he gathered the bundle, supporting it carefully as Atlas watched, ears twitching, body tense, tail low but steady. Outside, the fog shifted, revealing a faint glimmer of sunlight on the rusted hood of the car. The cold morning air carried the scent of wet metal, earth, and something faintly floral, like memory itself, sharp and undeniable. James held the blanket and the bundle close, feeling the weight of responsibility settle in his chest. Atlas stepped beside him, paws shifting on the frozen dirt, watching with eyes that glowed with sorrow and devotion. Together, they approached the rear of the car, preparing to give Emily the acknowledgement she had never received, the dignity her memory deserved. And as James laid the fragile remains on the blanket once more, Atlas let out a long, low whine, pressing his head into the veteran's arm. It was not despair, it was release. It was the unspoken understanding that the vigil had only just begun, but now, finally, it would be shared. James felt tears sting his eyes, and though he had endured the horrors of war, the smell of death and destruction, nothing had prepared him for this moment, the profound intersection of grief, loyalty, and love expressed through the devotion of a German shepherd who had carried a child's memory alone for years. The fog shifted again, curling around the car and the two figures kneeling beside it. Atlas pressed close to James, trembling slowly, eyes fixed on the small, mold-stained blanket. And in that silence, heavy with unspoken grief, James understood the truth of what he had stumbled upon. Atlas had not only survived tragedy, he had kept it alive, kept it sacred, and now it was James's turn to bear witness, to honor the decades of loyalty, and to ensure that Emily's story would finally be told. The distant rumble of approaching sirens echoed faintly through the fog as James gently guided Atlas back a few feet from the car. The shepherd remained tense, ears forward, muscles coiled like springs ready to snap, but he did not move away entirely. He was still tethered to the car and, more importantly, to the memory it contained. James knelt beside him, hand resting gently on Atlas's thick fur, feeling the rapid pulse beneath the coat, steady but strained, a heartbeat that had carried grief and loyalty for far too long. The veteran had seen fear and panic in countless forms, from the heat of combat to the silence of enemy ambushes, but this was different. This was the raw, undiluted weight of decades, carried by a dog who had witnessed tragedy no living soul had yet acknowledged. The first uniformed officer appeared on the edge of the fog, flashlight cutting through the gray veil like a knife. James called out softly, his voice firm but calm. "There's a dog, guarding the car, don't scare him." The officer nodded, raising his hand in acknowledgement, and his partner approached more cautiously, eyes widening as they took in the rusted vehicle and the German shepherd standing alert beside it. "We called it in," the first officer said, "but wow, looks abandoned for years." James didn't answer. Words would not capture what was happening. He only pressed a calming hand against Atlas's neck. The dog's golden eyes followed the officers as they moved closer, the low growl that had rumbled from his throat moments ago now softening into a subtle, controlled warning. Atlas's body language was precise, almost military in its execution, and James realized with a profound jolt that this dog's vigilance was unmatched, honed by loss and memory, not training. The officers approached slowly, one crouching to try to peer inside the torn interior of the car. James's heart thumped, but he said nothing. He trusted Atlas to signal when it was safe. And Atlas did. When the officer's flashlight beam caught the torn upholstery and rusted metal, the dog whined softly, almost imperceptibly, nudging James with his nose as if to say, "Look here, this is why I've stayed." The veteran followed Atlas's gesture, kneeling once again to inspect the interior. Torn fabric, frayed padding, and the corroded floor offered little explanation to an outsider, but James saw the traces of struggle, the claw marks in the mud outside, the sagging floor panel beneath the back seat, the faint discoloration that could only be remembered by a dog who had lived it. With careful hands, he lifted the warped floorboard, revealing the small bundle wrapped in the faded blue blanket. The authorities paused, realizing this was no ordinary abandoned car. Their flashlights trembled as they illuminated the remnants of a life, fragile bones wrapped in cloth, preserved by care even in death. Atlas let out a long, low whine, pressing his forehead into James's chest, trembling violently. The sound was mournful, guttural, and filled with a loyalty and grief that had accumulated over decades. James felt his own heart constrict, veteran training giving way to human empathy. He whispered softly, "You've been protecting her all this time. You never left her side, did you?" Atlas nudged him gently with his nose, affirming the truth. The dog had waited, guarded, and mourned, enduring hunger, cold, and isolation for years to ensure that Emily's memory remained unbroken. The officers moved carefully, documenting the scene with cameras and notes, but James ensured Atlas stayed beside him, a silent sentinel overseeing the process. He could feel the dog's eyes on the car, unblinking, unyielding. Atlas had not only survived, but had remained steadfast in purpose, and now James was there to acknowledge the sacrifice, to bear witness. Every instinct in the veteran flared: protect, respect, honor. And honor meant ensuring Atlas's devotion, the child's life, and the memory they both carried were treated with reverence. The fog began to lift slightly, and a faint beam of sunlight glimmered on the rusted roof of the car. James lifted the small shoe and placed it atop the blanket, the final touch of recognition for Emily, small but monumental. Atlas pressed close, body tense but steady, ears forward, tail low and controlled. The dog's presence anchored the scene. James could feel the gravity of years of grief, discipline, and love emanating from him. He whispered again, gently, almost to himself, "You've kept her safe, boy. Now we'll make sure the world knows." Atlas's eyes shimmered with something almost human, relief, recognition, and the understanding that the vigil had been shared, that the burden had finally been acknowledged. As the authorities carefully carried the bundle from the car, Atlas followed at James's side, body poised and attentive, but finally a subtle relaxation washed over him. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, then sat, watching the scene with the vigilance of a soldier still honoring a fallen comrade. James knelt, brushing his hand through Atlas's thick fur, whispering words of gratitude, connection, and acknowledgement. "You did your duty," he said. "You kept her safe when no one else could." The dog's tail gave a faint wag, head resting on James's knee. It was a silent acceptance, a release of the decades of sorrow and devotion carried alone. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving only the soft patter of rain beginning to touch the earth. Atlas's body had finally relaxed, though his eyes never left the car. James knew that the veteran's duty had shifted from witnessing war to witnessing loyalty, grief, and memory preserved in the golden eyes of a German shepherd. And in that quiet, heavy moment, he realized that the bond between them was unspoken but indelible. Two beings honoring a life lost, a story preserved, and a devotion that had endured beyond the boundaries of time, isolation, and sorrow. The rain had started in earnest now, gentle at first, tapping the rusted roof of the car and pooling in the dents and crevices like tiny mirrors reflecting the gray sky. James knelt beside Atlas, feeling the steady tremor of the dog's body beneath his hands. The shepherd's loyalty and grief had carried him through years of solitude, and now, at last, that weight was shared. The veteran understood that the dog had never been guarding simply a car. He had been guarding a life, a memory, and a promise that the child, Emily, would not be forgotten, no matter how the world had failed her. James could feel the depth of Atlas's vigil, the unspoken code of devotion carried for years in silence, in patience, in sorrow, and in love. James gently lifted the faded blue blanket, inspecting it again. The fabric was stiff with age, mold, and weather, yet it had preserved what remained of Emily. Her name, stitched so delicately in the corner, burned in his mind. Emily. The veteran ran a hand across it reverently, tracing each letter, each curve. Atlas lowered his head further, pressing into James's side, shivering slightly, as though the act of remembering carried its own physical toll. The rain drummed softly, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, tying them to the moment in a way that transcended words. It was as if the sky itself mourned with them, acknowledging decades of silence, solitude, and unwavering devotion. James reached into the interior of the car again, flashlight illuminating the shadows. The torn upholstery, rusted metal, and remnants of torn fabric told a story of struggle, fear, and finality. There was no malice, no deliberate cruelty, only the harsh and indifferent hand of circumstance, leaving Emily vulnerable and Atlas-bound to witness her fate. Beneath a partially detached panel, he found an old photograph, surprisingly intact despite the years of neglect and decay. In it, two children stood on a sunlit lawn, each holding a puppy. One of the puppies was Atlas, dark-coated and alert even then, while the other, presumably Emily's companion, peeked out shyly beside him. The children's eyes glimmered with innocence, unaware of the tragedy that would follow, and their smiles were bright, untainted, holding a moment frozen in time. James felt the lump in his throat grow, a mix of sorrow, wonder, and recognition of what had been lost. Atlas sniffed the photograph gently, ears twitching, eyes never leaving James's face. He whined softly, a sound that vibrated with the memory of long-ago warmth and loss. James understood immediately. The dog had not only been guarding Emily's remains, but also the memory of love, the fragments of a family, of a life that had been ripped away. The veteran felt a wave of understanding wash over him. Atlas's vigil had been about more than protection. It had been about honoring a bond that death could not sever, carrying Emily's story alone through years of silence. The rain fell harder, droplets pattering against James's jacket and running down his face, mingling with the tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He carefully gathered the photograph, the blanket, and the small shoe, placing them together on the hood of the rusted car. Atlas moved closer, circling once, then sitting beside him, head low, tail stiff but relaxed. The dog's posture spoke volumes. He was ready to let go, but only if James promised that Emily would be remembered, that her story would no longer remain hidden in the shadows of rust and fog. James stood slowly, brushing the rain from his shoulders, and looked down at Atlas. "We'll make sure she's remembered," he said firmly. "No more hiding, no more silence." The shepherd's ears twitched, and his golden eyes met James's with a clarity and depth that cut through the fog, the rain, and the weight of decades. Atlas exhaled softly, a shuddering breath that seemed to release some fraction of the grief he had carried for years. He lowered his head, resting against James's leg, no longer tense, no longer burdened by the loneliness of a vigil carried in silence. James knew then that their next step had to be deliberate. He would not leave this car standing as a tomb for decades more, not when Atlas had endured so much. He retrieved the small bundle of remains once again, cradling them carefully, Atlas nudging gently with his nose, guiding him toward a clearing beyond the road where the earth was soft and the wind carried the smell of pine and soil. The shepherd's paws pressed into the mud as they walked together, moving in silence, each step a quiet acknowledgement of decades of sorrow, devotion, and unbroken loyalty. They arrived at a large oak tree overlooking the field, its limbs stretching wide as if embracing the world. James knelt, preparing a small greave beneath the roots, the soil damp from the rain. Atlas sat beside him, alert but relaxed, head low, body pressed close, as though the very act of laying Emily to rest would ease the weight on his chest. Carefully, James placed the blanket, the photograph, and the shoe into the earth, brushing the soil gently over them, patting it down with deliberate reverence. Atlas pressed his nose to the ground, a soft whine escaping as the rain fell heavier, washing over them both. The veteran reached down, stroking the dog's back. "It's done, Atlas. She's home now. You did what no one else could." The shepherd exhaled slowly, tilting his head to rest against James's shoulder. The rain tapered off, clouds breaking to reveal a muted sun shining through the mist. The field glimmered, wet and fresh, as if the earth itself recognized the closure that had finally been achieved. Atlas lifted his head, eyes meeting James's, filled with a quiet understanding. The vigil was over, the memory honored, and the bond that had carried them through decades of sorrow now shared and acknowledged. James stood slowly, Atlas following, paws sinking slightly into the soft mud. Together they gazed at the oak and the fresh grave beneath it. The silence was profound, not empty, but full of acknowledgement, release, and reverence. Atlas's eyes were bright now, no longer haunted, no longer burdened by grief carried alone. And in the distance, the road ahead shimmered, mist curling around it, hinting at the life that awaited them both, a life unbroken, shared, and filled with the quiet, enduring promise of loyalty, love, and remembrance. The sun had finally pierced through the mist, scattering a pale golden light across the wet field, reflecting off droplets clinging to the branches of the old oak. James stood beside Atlas, taking a deep breath of the damp, earthy air. He had never expected a drive to the countryside to lead him to a rusted car, a forgotten child, and a guardian dog who had carried grief for decades. Yet here he was, a veteran who had seen humanity's darkest and most heroic moments, humbled by a simple, unwavering act of devotion. Atlas pressed close, head brushing against James's leg, and the veteran felt the weight of years begin to lift, not just from the dog, but from himself. The bond between them, forged in sorrow and understanding, was unspoken, yet profound. James surveyed the small grave beneath the oak, where the blanket, the tiny shoe, and the photograph now rested. The soil was still damp, freshly pressed and molded into the final resting place for Emily. Atlas sat beside him, ears perked, eyes steady, watching the spot like a sentinel who had finally fulfilled his duty. James knelt beside the dog, running a hand along the thick, warm fur that had carried decades of grief, loyalty, and memory. "You did it, Atlas. You kept her safe all these years. You didn't give up." The shepherd nudged his hand with a soft, reassuring nudge, a gentle acknowledgement of the words and the release of a burden carried too long. The veteran allowed himself a small smile, knowing that some acts of loyalty were eternal, beyond comprehension, and beyond the passage of time. As the rain ceased and the clouds began to part, James noticed the subtle movement in Atlas, ears twitching, muscles relaxing, tail swishing softly against the mud. For the first time in decades, the dog's vigilance had transformed into quiet relief. James understood that this was not only closure for Emily, but for Atlas as well. The years of standing guard, of waiting, of remembering had finally been witnessed, acknowledged, and honored. Atlas had been more than a dog. He had been a guardian, a witness, a living testament to devotion that transcended time, hardship, and sorrow. James thought about the life Emily had been denied, the childhood she had never fully lived, and the love that had been lost along with her. He imagined her laughter echoing through the house, Atlas bounding alongside her in playful leaps, her tiny hands wrapped around the dog's thick fur. In the photograph, she had smiled, and he allowed himself to picture that happiness extended into the life she should have had. It was a bittersweet vision, a mixture of mourning and hope. James knew that he couldn't bring her back, but he could ensure that her memory endured, that Atlas's vigil was recognized, and that their story would be told. Carefully, James patted Atlas on the head and rose to his feet, brushing rain-soaked sleeves from his jacket. The shepherd rose as well, stretching his powerful limbs, tail low but relaxed, eyes meeting James's with unspoken gratitude. Together, they walked away from the oak and the grave, side by side, leaving the rusted car behind, a relic of tragedy, but also of loyalty and love that had endured beyond the years. The field stretched ahead, green and glistening, the mist lifting to reveal a path forward. James knew this path would not erase the sorrow of what had been lost, but it would honor it, and he could feel the profound weight of that acknowledgement settling around both him and the dog. As they reached the edge of the field, James stopped and looked back one final time. Atlas sat quietly, gazing toward the oak, a sentinel even in his newfound peace. James knelt, scratching behind Atlas's ears, his voice low and steady. "You did everything right. You didn't just protect her body, you protected her memory. You carried her story until I came along." Atlas exhaled softly, a long, shuddering breath, as though releasing decades of grief in a single exhale. His golden eyes, once filled with the intensity of vigilance, now glimmered with relief and trust, a reflection of the bond they had forged in this extraordinary moment. James understood then that life was measured not only in the victories or losses we claim for ourselves, but also in the devotion we witness in others, the quiet, relentless acts of love, loyalty, and remembrance that endure when the world has moved on. Atlas had carried the weight of Emily's life, her death, and her memory all these years, and James had been honored to witness it. The dog had survived, grieved, and guarded without complaint, embodying a pure, unwavering devotion that the veteran could scarcely comprehend, but would never forget. As they walked together toward the distant road, Atlas at his side, James felt a sense of peace settle over him. The sun broke fully through the clouds, scattering warm light over the wet earth, illuminating the path ahead. He glanced down at Atlas, whose golden eyes met his own with a quiet understanding, a bond that could never be severed. Emily's story had been told at last, and the faithful guardian who had carried it for decades could finally rest in spirit. James felt a profound gratitude, both for the dog's loyalty and for the opportunity to witness it. He knew that wherever Atlas went from here, he would carry the weight of that devotion with pride and calm, and that together they had honored a life, a memory, and the enduring power of love. The field faded behind them as they walked on, mist curling at their feet, and James understood that some acts of devotion, though born of heartbreak, were eternal. Atlas's golden eyes reflected the sun now, bright and warm, and James knew that the faithful dog's story and Emily's memory would live on forever, in every step, in every breath, and in the quiet moments that followed, filled with remembrance, respect, and unbroken loyalty.